That's your microphone. Mute that.
I unmuted it. Oh.
Okay, so with the recording going, welcome once more to tonight's lecture of the Global Learning Center on Ukraine, lecture and panel discussion. The Global Learning Center was founded in 1988 with the mission to do education on global issues, with the idea that the more we know about each other, the more we understand, the less likely it is that we wage war on each other. And unfortunately, here we are, and there's yet another war going on in the world. And so we put together this event to get some background on what's happening. We have two panelists tonight. That's online. We have Professor Nabil AlTikriti. He's a professor of Middle East history at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia. He has served as a consultant, election monitor, and relief worker in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and served on the Doctors Without Borders USA Board of Directors, among many other things. And here in person with us is John Dreifort. He's a historian, professor of history at State University, and specializes in...
Nancy, what that'll do is stop this. Your camera's off. Click view. Side by side gallery. Maybe that'll give us enough.
I accidentally muted the speaker.
Oh, okay. Well, the dangers of having a co-host on Zoom.
Just click exit full screen.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Turn your speakers on.
So again, Professor Dreifort is a historian at Wichita State, specializing in 19th and 20th century European diplomacy, which of course ties into events around the globe and certainly is relevant to what's happening in Ukraine now. He is also interested in the history of baseball, I understand.
Would you rather me take this back to the bedroom?
All right.
Rather me take this back to the bedroom.
Okay, so we'll start with Dr. Tikriti's presentation. He prepared a few slides. Then Dr. Dreifort may add to that, and then the majority of our time should be dedicated to just questions and answers. And that will be a little bit challenging as we have quite a few people joining us online in Zoom, as well as quite a few people here in person. And so I may have to repeat questions for the other half of the audience and so on, but we'll make it work. All right, finally, before we get started, just a quick thank you to the First Unitarian Universalist Church, which is where we are located in person, and who are hosting us free of charge. So, all right, with that, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'll just start by saying something that it may seem a bit odd for someone who's a historian of the Middle East to be speaking about Ukraine. So I should just clarify that. And that is that I've been to Ukraine 3 times as an election observer. That was 2004, 2014, and 2019. So I saw some of the major elections in their recent political history. And in the course of those elections, traveled to Nikopol, Berdyansk, and Lviv. And I also lived for a year in Azerbaijan on a Fulbright more recently, and observed elections in about 4 or 5 other former Soviet republics. So I've come to know the former Soviet Union reasonably well through election observation. And what I'm presenting you today is basically, I was going to walk through some historical maps and then some slides dealing with sort of Soviet perspectives or Russian perspectives, and then go through perhaps and then there's 3 or 4 on the elections, and then the goals of Russia. And I want to try to make the goal of this talk to present what I understand to be the Russian perspective, or if you want to reduce it to Putin, you could, but I'm always uncomfortable when we reduce things to a single player. So start the story with the earliest map that I think matters, and that is the formation of Kievan Rus, which is a medieval entity, and here's it in the 10th century. Now, I cannot claim any further expertise on this, except to point out that both Ukraine and Russia trace their origins to Kievan Rus, and that is a blistering medieval history argument that is raging between the two. And I couldn't find it just now, but there's a nice meme on social media where the Ukrainians show a picture of Kievan Rus in, I don't know, 1050, the year 1050, and then show a picture of Moscow in 1050, and Moscow is basically just a swamp in 1050. So they claim origins. It's an origins debate, and I don't know that there is a right side in that, but there is a blazing origins debate going on. Now, in this particular map, this is Kievan Rus a couple of hundred years later. The major factor to point out is the Golden Horde. And that is one of the 4 major Mongol spin-off empires after the death of Chinggis Khan in 1227. And I think the point I would raise there is there's a whole historical line of reasoning that says Russia's got more to do with the Mongols than it has to do with Europe. And that explains things about its architecture, its political traditions, and its relations with not only Europe, but also Central Asia and going east. So I'll just point out that the Golden Horde is all dominant in the 13th century. And so there's another map. Now, these next few maps kind of trace who ruled Ukraine in the early modern period, and where does Ukraine even come into the picture as an entity. And here I'll point out, this is southern Ukraine and Crimea. Up through the 17th century, that was completely dominated by either the Ottoman Empire or Poland, and more properly, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is its own whole history. And one of the things to point out in this map is you finally have Muscovy, which is the predecessor to the Russian Empire, making an impact. So they start to matter, I believe around in the 17th century. And the story from the 17th century to the 20th century is the Russian Empire expanding at the expense of the Ottoman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So much so that by 1792, Poland ceases to exist as an entity until it's reborn in 1920. It's not like the Poles went anywhere, by the way, they were still there, or the Ukrainians for that matter. Now, in this next map, this is a revolt which happened in the 1640s and 1650s, which seems to be some kind of founding revolt for Ukrainian history and identity. And I don't, again, not really an expert on this, but it seems like what the Russians claim is the center of Ukrainianness is this region towards the south at that time. And they claim that the rest of Ukraine got added by foreign powers later. I'll show a slide kind of pointing that out later. And this is the period where the Ottoman Empire is starting to shrink and Muscovy is starting to expand at the expense of the Ottomans and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, another thing to point out about the history back in the 17th century is that in effect, the Ukrainians are split in their influences between the legacies of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the legacies of the Russian Empire expanding, which in effect explains a lot of the ethnolinguistic map of Ukraine today, which is another slide I'll get to later. That's why they're divided between Catholics and Orthodox, and as well as divided linguistically between those in the far west, who are very close to Poland in many ways, and those in the far east who are very close to Russia. So this is the Ukrainian lands after 1667, and Zaporizhzhia and the Hetmanate, which is a Cossack state, tend to be or start to come into play, and they're also part of the story. And if someone knows better, someone might explain later in the Q&A, for example, how the Cossacks enter into this, because I see them kind of being identified both with Ukrainian nationalism and with Russian nationalism at various points. So fast forward to 1740, you see the Russian Empire getting larger again, so I don't need to linger too much on this one. The other power that starts to matter in the 18th century are the Habsburgs, or what we later, after 1867, call the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Galicia is a term for a region that the Habsburgs ran pretty much in the 18th and 19th centuries, and that is the region that is far western Ukraine today. And it'll matter in a political map again in a moment. All right, so here we have, fast forwarding quite a bit, we skipped the whole 19th century, go straight to 1919, and this is the proposal by the Ukrainian nationalists at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And I've taught a bit about the peace conference as it relates to the Middle East, and I'll just say generally what happened after World War I is they threw this peace conference, and you can imagine an awful lot of men around very large tables poring over maps and trying to figure out what to do with the post-war order. And every nationalist group came to this conference and presented the largest map they could think they could ever possibly persuade them that they could get away with. So that's what I think of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. You see it in the Middle East for sure, where there was a Kurdish, Armenian, Turkish, Arab, Zionist, and other delegations coming to the peace conference. Here you have the Ukrainian version. Then you have the Ukraine SSR. Now, this is not a stable map. You might think, well, this is what Ukraine was in the Soviet Union. You would be wrong. This is only Ukraine in 1922. If you have your photographic memory of what Ukraine looks like today, you'll notice that it got more territory here and here later. And that's part of the historical argument, is what happened in the 20th century. And I'll explain that, I believe, in another slide. No, if I don't get a chance to, I'll do it now. I may come back to it in a later slide. First of all, there's Crimea. Crimea was transferred from Russia to Ukraine by the Ukrainian Soviet premier, the one after Stalin. What was that fellow's name? Everybody knows it, Khrushchev. So Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, transferred Crimea from Russia to Ukraine. And it seems that it's an overwhelmingly Russian-speaking region from the ethnolinguistic maps of today. The other regions that got added are here and here, and that's what's being fought over today, Luhansk and Donetsk. And those were also, at some point, by the way, not in the 1950s under Khrushchev, this region to the east was transferred over to Ukraine in the 1920s under Lenin, or so I understand to be the case. There's another accretion. So Ukraine grew. The original Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic grew here because of Lenin, here because of Khrushchev, and then over here after World War II at the expense of Poland, and Stalin negotiated that the border would move something like 200 miles to the west. And so the Soviet Union got bits of Poland, and sort of in compensation, Poland got bits of Germany. So there were Polish refugees streaming out of the Soviet Union, but there were also German refugees streaming out of Poland into Germany. So that's a big part of the post-World War II story. I don't have maps for that, but that's why Ukraine today is bigger than this map that you see there. All right, so now just to shake things up a little bit, I'll show you a couple of Soviet posters. So this is from 1939, and I understand the Russian to read, "If we see the enemy's ugly mug, something will happen. I guess we're gonna hit him with a gun." And this gets into the whole denazification issue, because here's another 1940 poster, and it's of the UPA. And you see in Cyrillic up there, Slava Ukraini. So that's the slogan that they're using today, long live Ukraine. And you see the emblem here of the symbol that is the Ukrainian national symbol as well. And there is an issue there. The UPA was fighting with the Germans in World War II. So when they say denazification, this is who they mean. And what they're referring to are the right-wing, far west, you could say extremist Ukrainian nationalists. Now that doesn't explain the rest of the country. It just explains the far west. What is today Lviv is pretty much the center of that. And this flag that you see on the lower left is the flag colors of the far right Ukrainian nationalists. And they're not really being, we're not really being told much about that. We're just being told that denazification is absurd. And yeah, it may not be a very strong claim. I kind of would agree, but it is something. And it is something that starts in World War II, and it is something that definitely matters in Russia. And I could point out some other anecdotes, but perhaps in the Q&A, I could say some of the encounters I had in Lviv. All right, then moving on, there's the whole issue of the Warsaw Pact and today's NATO enlargement. So in the 1970s, here's a poster which says that the Warsaw Pact, well, it doesn't say that. It's basically an image of the Warsaw Pact defending its citizens from the Black Octopus. And the Black Octopus in this case is the West. And I have a map of the Warsaw Pact coming up, and you'll see that actually in this audience, I think you'll remember how big the Warsaw Pact was back in the day. So here's another Warsaw Pact poster from 1987 saying Warsaw Pact, Army of Peace, defending labor. And so that's the image of the Warsaw Pact right before it collapsed. So here's 1989, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. And I'm sure many of you remember this. And that is when NATO was not nearly as large as it is today. In effect, NATO has doubled in size. Now, the counter argument, of course, is that NATO is a peace alliance, or sorry, a defense alliance, and therefore it shouldn't matter. But I'm quite confident that that's not how Russia sees it. Russia sees it as encroaching on its own territory. And I would argue that they have something of an argument there for various reasons. One is there were verbal guarantees made by politicians in 1992 that NATO would not enlarge and would not grow. And those verbal guarantees were given by like John Major and I'm not sure who else, but John Major is the one I've heard. And the argument there, or the counter argument, is that these verbal guarantees were just that. They were verbal guarantees of politicians in power. And once they left power, the guarantee left with them. And the other counter argument is that NATO is an alliance which sovereign states are allowed to join if they meet a bunch of conditions. And those who have joined it have met those conditions and freely and fairly, democratically decided to join. That's the NATO argument. But the Russian argument is, wait, hold on a minute. We disbanded the Warsaw Pact. It no longer exists. It stopped existing right away in the late 80s, early 90s. And you said you wouldn't expand, and here you are right on our frontier. Not by the way with Ukraine, but right on their frontier vis-a-vis the Baltic states, Lithuania Estonia, and Latvia, the ones who are, up this way. I can't get my arrow to work very well. So next up, so this is NATO today. Actually, it's not NATO today because somebody colored Ukraine NATO. I don't know why that is on there. That is a mistake. I just did this before the lecture. So Ukraine is definitely not in NATO. And that makes this whole map suspect, to be honest. So take Ukraine out of NATO, everything else appears to be correct. So you can see how much larger it is now than it once was. All right, another factor in the history of this in the last 30 years is the Budapest Memorandum, where in the Clinton administration, there was a treaty or an agreement between Russia, Ukraine, and the US, whereby Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for ironclad recognition of its sovereignty. In other words, nobody would ever invade it. Clearly, that was a mistake from the Ukrainian perspective. The Russian perspective, however, is that NATO enlargement has sort of nullified that agreement back in 1994. I think if you're looking at it from the outside, it's pretty clear that if you have nukes, you have a certain amount of power that you don't have without nukes. Just ask North Korea versus, Iran and Iraq. So another aspect of this, and that is a lovely poster, by the way. That is a poster from the 1950s showing Soviet-Chinese friendship, beautifully homoerotic, I might add. And the point there is that there is this ideologue, fellow named Alexander Dugin, who I would urge you to look up afterwards, because Dugin's kind of the thinking behind Putin's ideology, if you will. And he's argued that there should be a Eurasia bloc, and the Eurasia bloc should consist of China and Russia together, along with those who would agree to join, which would presumably be the Central Asian states, as well as Iran, potentially India, and others who are basically trying to join forces against the West and Western domination. And that is part of what's driving them. They're hoping that China will pretty much solve all problems. Now, while China certainly has the capacity to solve all problems, because let's not kid ourselves, they're huge at this point, economically and otherwise, they've been kind of riding the fence, and it should be our hope that they continue to ride the fence, because if China gets in on this, we're in trouble, very deep trouble, which is why we should not escalate, but that's another issue. So now I switch to the ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. And the thing to look at here, and when I show you the election maps, remember this map, right? What you see here is that the East is mostly Russian speaking, and the West is mostly Ukrainian speaking. Now, and to clarify, I don't know either language, so I can't exactly go deeper than that. But when I said, is it similar to the difference between Spanish and Portuguese, most folks were like, yeah, that's not so far off, although they didn't know Spanish and Portuguese, so who's to say? But yeah, they are mutually intelligible. They can make sense out of each other's language, that is Ukrainian and Russian. So they're in the same language family, but they're different languages within that language family. They're both Slavic languages. But Ukrainian is much closer to Polish. And I think Polish and Russian are barely mutually intelligible, which is, so think of it as a spectrum, like you're going from this extreme to this extreme, and Ukrainian somewhere in the middle as a language. But look at it geographically. This region here to the east and south is primarily Russian speakers, and this region to the west and north is primarily Ukrainian speakers. And that is a major aspect of the conflict, or the ground underneath the conflict. All right, so then there's this Novorossiya issue, and that gets into that ethno-linguistic map. And by the way, this map is crazy busy. So my apologies, it was the best I could find from Novorossiya. So Novorossiya means New Russia in Russian. And it seems to me that it's not an old name, it's a new name. It's what the Russian government has decided to call the south and east of Ukraine. In other words, they've coined a new term for this whole region, and that new term is Novorossiya. And it seems like their inner goal of this conflict is to divide. I mean, that's what this map suggests. And by the way, I should point out that I got this map from a Russian site. So this is effectively, if you will, the Russian perspective. They seem to be arguing that Novorossiya, this part here with the Russian flag, is what they're after. This part with the Ukrainian flag can still be Ukraine. And this part over here can be a third entity, which they're calling Galicia. Remember Galicia from that other slide. And Galicia is what's closest to Poland. In effect, they're arguing for the retreat back east of what was taken in the 1940s by Stalin. So this map summarizes it. And this map, by the way, or it summarizes the additions to Ukraine from a Russian political perspective. So this is what the Russians are arguing. They're arguing that this was Ukraine in 1654. And if I go all the way back to the 17th century map, that coincides with Zaporizhzhia, I think it was. I'm not sure I'm remembering the name exactly, but it begins with a Z, and it was on that earlier map. And so what they're arguing is that was Ukraine in 1654, and then all the rest of this got added later, basically by Russian or Soviet leaders. And that's the Russian perspective. So I cannot argue, or I cannot address the accuracy of this yellow claim at all, because I just don't know early modern Russian history well enough to say. But this blue argument about Lenin and Crimea and Lviv all seems to be accurate as far as I know. I know for sure that Crimea and Western Ukraine is accurate. I'm not as sure about what happened in 1922. Now, this, by the way, is a fairly humorous Ukrainian response. And what it says is, this was Russia, basically the original Principality of Muscovy in the 13th century. So they're saying, yeah, this is Russia here. And all of this got added by Chinggis Khan, which gets back into the Golden Horde. This was added by, I think that's Japan, but I'm not sure. And this was added by the Ottoman Empire. This was added by Germany when it lost World War II. And then this was added by that surly looking fellow in the upper left corner. That's a Ukrainian response. Now I'm going to show you some election slides, and notice the divide. And that's the interesting thing about the election slide. So in 2004, the first election that I went to and observed, Yushchenko defeated Yanukovych. And Yanukovych was the one that was very close to Putin. Putin's been in power since, I think, 2000. So he was already in power. And Putin has always had a keen interest in Ukrainian elections and has done everything he could to try and ensure that his ally would win the elections. His ally in this case was Yanukovych. But Yushchenko won, so the pro-Western candidate won. And I don't remember the proportions, but it was close. It was like, 51-49, 52-48. But notice how it jives with the ethnolinguistic map. The next major election, Yanukovych defeated Tymoshenko. And Tymoshenko, if you ever see a picture of her, she's got this sort of traditional hairstyle with the braids that she puts up, and she likes to dress in traditional outfits. But apparently she was very, very corrupt. So this could be read at least as an anti-corruption vote. But again, look at the election map and compare it to the ethno-linguistic mapping. In other words, Yanukovych won, but he only managed to win a little bit in the West. Then in 2014, after Yanukovych was clearly off the charts corrupt, in a Ukrainian context anyway, there were the Euromaidan protests. And the protests were against Yanukovych because Yanukovych was bringing the country ever closer to Russia and ever closer to Putin. Mind you, that wasn't the only issue. It was corruption. It was which way to turn. Do you turn west or do you turn east? And it was also about autocracy and repression. Now, I'll point out, this is a standard memorial for those who died in those protests, but this is a poster that is commemorating Stepan Bandera. And Stepan Bandera was the leader of the far-right extremist Ukrainians until he was killed in the 1950s. And the point there is that 1959 he died. He was the leader of the far-right Ukrainian nationalist, and there's a poster at those protests sort of commemorating him and, if you will, glorifying him. By the way, I took both those pictures. I don't have a lot of my own pictures in this presentation, but I can claim those two. Copyright me. All right, so then you got the 2014 election right after those protests, and this time Poroshenko defeated Timoshenko after Yanukovych fled. And Yanukovych fled because of this big Maidan protest or set of protests. Immediately after this election, actually, no, before this election, sorry, Russia occupied Crimea. And there seems to be a difference between Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk in terms of, shall we say, the legitimacy or the popularity of the move, right? Because in Russia, at least, Russians are like 90% in support of taking the Crimea, which clearly shows that they see it as a Russian province, going all the way back to Catherine the Great, who brought it into the Russian Empire. Whereas Luhansk and Donetsk are far more ambiguous from sort of the Russian perspective. From an international perspective, if we're going to next go to negotiations, which at some point should happen, there is a difference between Crimea and the two eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. All right, so here's the most recent election, 2019. I was there as well. And notice that this time Zelensky just blew away Poroshenko. Poroshenko, by the way, briefly was a chocolate manufacturer. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Ukrainian chocolate is world standard necessarily, but it's regionally famous. And he had the biggest chocolate company, and that's how he made his money. And that's how he came to power between 2014 and 2019. And notice that the only area that still voted for Poroshenko was the far west, the homeland of the far-right Ukrainian nationalists. Now, Zelensky doesn't really represent them. He's representing a more all-Ukraine agenda. And Zelensky himself, as I'm sure you've heard, is kind of an interesting figure because he was a comedy actor, a comedian, before he became president. And if you haven't done it yet, Google Zelensky dancing, and you will see this amazing video of him effectively in drag, dancing as if he were at a club with 3 or 4 other guys. He basically put out a music video. So his prior career is a bit like, I don't know, Stephen Colbert or something, but then he became president and now is a completely different figure than he was before that election. So in a sense, to wrap up, here's what I think are the Russian goals. Ukraine regime change, which goes back to those elections. In other words, they again want a pro-Russian leader. Stop NATO enlargement, roll it back if you can. Mind you, Poland and Hungary and the Baltic states, there's no way they're going to give up NATO. So I don't know how we can roll it back, but he can certainly stop it from getting any further. Novorossiya is the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. He would like that to be added to Russia. He'd like Crimea to be recognized as part of Russia. He wants Ukrainian neutrality, which means they never join NATO. The Eurasian bloc is sort of a bigger idea of joining together with anyone in Eurasia that will not just roll over to the West. So think China, Iran, which can be added to as India and Central Asia and other powers. And then denazification is kind of trying to destroy far right-wing extremist Ukrainian nationalism in Western Ukraine. And that's all I've got. So I hope that wasn't too long or too dirty, but I'll happily revisit any of that in Q&A to the extent that I can. And I turn the floor over to your other speaker.
Thank you so much. I already have a million questions, but yeah, let's.
Sure.
You, well, that's fine. We can take some questions now, or unless you want to add something first.
Well, why don't you go ahead and ask questions while it's fresh in your mind, and you can ask questions of him, and I'll fill in.
Okay, we can take some questions. So both online, you can type into the chat or unmute yourself if you raise your hand. Use the Zoom raise your hand feature and I'll get to you. Or if we have questions here, Father Stephen, can I bring the mic around so that we can hear?
I just want to say something about the denazification.
I'm sorry, I don't hear it.
Does this work? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now, I think.
Okay. I'm a priest of the Ukrainian Byzantine Greek Catholic Rite in the Catholic Church, and I've been there 15 times. I'm retired now. And living here in Wichita because I'm from here, but I've been to Ukraine 15 times, and I lived in Toronto for about 38 years, and I taught the grandson of Stefan Bandera. He was in high school where I taught, and my understanding of the denazification, that it is true that in the western part of Ukraine, they met the Nazi or the Deutsches Waffen, the German army, with flowers and wreaths and bread and salt, because the Ukrainian people, the story I always got, was 33 million of them had been starved to death by Stalin. And so they were not exactly Nazis, but they were very pleased to get out from under the thumb of Stalin. And so another problem was that under the Poles, I noticed among these people that I served that were in my parish, most of them were from the Oblast of Ternopil, which is in the far west of the Ukraine, that there was a strain of anti-Semitism. But then I found out through talking to all the people in the various parishes that what the Polish did when they conquered the western part of Ukraine, they would take Jewish managers of their estates and put them over their estates, and the simple Ukrainian peasants, when they saw the reality of their churches being closed by the Jews, the managers, became very anti-Jewish, and they kept that. And that happened from 1650 or 60. 2/3 of the western Ukraine were by then Union, and they were dealing with this the Jewish managers of their estates. So that's where that strain of anti-Semitism comes in. If you add that to the German army coming into the western part of the Ukraine and getting them out from underneath the thumb of Stalin, there you have what the world as Putin sees as the Nazification, and that he thinks that he has to denazify. But there's historical reasons for all of those things, for both of those things. And it's important to remember that, I think.
Thank you. Anecdotally, I mean, I can't really speak to the comment about the managers and the farms because I have no idea about that at all. But I have met several American Ukrainians and Canadian Ukrainians. It's not all that well known, by the way, but there's 3 to 4 million Canadian Ukrainians, which I had no idea until my election partner in Lviv was a Ukrainian Canadian. And she was very enthusiastically Ukrainian nationalist, and she had relatives all over Lviv. And I guess I would just point out that the Ukrainians I've met, or the Ukrainian Americans and Ukrainian Canadians I've met, basically have said, or one of them at least said, that she was very proud of her her grandfather's service in World War II, fighting with the Ukrainian nationalists, and she was convinced that he had done nothing wrong. Everybody's experience is individual and therefore anecdotal, but I do notice in a historical sense that when there was Holocaust studies 10, 15, 20 years ago, the Ukrainian nationalists of UPA were considered quite negatively. But now, more recently, it seems like they're being rehabilitated in terms of their historical image. Also, I should have said Holodomor is the famine, and I should have mentioned that. That was something I forgot to mention. So it is definitely correct that between something like 1929 and 1932, something like 2 to 4 million Ukrainians died in a famine. And I will just point out on that the perception of that famine up until the 1990s was that it was, oops, communism isn't effective at feeding people. But in the last 10 years, it's been turned into Stalin was out to kill Ukrainians. And I think that both can be true at the same time. In other words, it can just be that communism was ineffective at feeding its people, and Stalin wanted to crush the Ukrainians. I'll point out that Kazakhstan had an equally devastating famine at the exact same time that Ukraine had it. And interestingly enough, that Kazakh famine, which also killed something like 3 to 4 million people, has been completely forgotten and is not really talked about in Kazakhstan, at least not in my perception when I served there as an observer twice. I asked about it and they're just like, we don't know. They didn't seem to think it was a big deal, which I think has to do with the politics of Kazakhstan today.
May I ask a question, if you don't mind? My name is Sakib. When you say that there was a territory donated by the Soviet head of the state to the Ukraine during a time like 1950s, which included Crimea as well as the eastern side of Ukraine, doesn't it make today's Ukraine case very weaker in the sense that the Russia is claiming its own territory that was actually gifted by Soviet Union to Ukraine in the time of Soviets? Do you think that?
I mean, that's what the Russian argument would be. And as a native of Louisiana, if Texas ever comes over the Red River, we're going to get them all. Which is to say, this was one country not so long ago. And in effect, you're seeing the states go after each other. And if it ever happens in the US, that's exactly the type of thing you'll be seeing. But all joking aside, yes, I think it does mean that, at least in a historical political argument, at least in their own perception of the justness of their cause, that's why the Russians feel that it is just. And I'll also point out that prior to this invasion, they probably had a lot of support in Eastern Ukraine. But once the invasion happened, support evaporated, and suddenly everyone became a Ukrainian nationalist, or at least that's what it seems from a perspective of sitting in the US. I'm not really 100% certain that that's accurate, but that's the perception that I have sitting here in Virginia. The other thing I'll point out is, sometimes you don't really know what's true halfway around the world when you only can watch your own media. Luhansk and Donetsk have been partially occupied since 2014. Like they were pro-Russian breakaway provinces. Now, they didn't get the entire province, they pretty much split it. And I wonder, I don't actually know, but I wonder if they decided to invade because they felt as though Ukraine was going to be able to retake what they lost in 2014. And I also wonder if Ukraine had been mounting a major offensive in those two regions prior to the February invasion. The reason I mention that is I was watching that very closely, but I only saw one mention of fighting in Luhansk and Donetsk prior to the invasion, but I did hear about it once. So I kind of wonder what might have been going on in the ground that they just decided wasn't important enough to tell us about.
All right. Well, maybe one brief comment on then we move on with.
I don't hear you.
The whole history of Russia, Soviet Union, Ukraine, and other republics based on lies, because they exist. Great Tatar, which occupied the whole territory, starting from Moscow. And Moscow, what does it mean for you? It means Moscow. It belonged to Tatar people, this city. All this story is camouflaged and manipulated because we don't know the real story. Great Tatar occupied from Moscow to Japan. Okay? And Crimea was in south of Ukraine, it was Little Tatar. What is happening never shown in any history. I was reading.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear any of that.
And said the answer to Machiavelli, Frederick I, he was writing about Little Tatar and Great Tatar. I was so curious what this country exists and what happened to Ukraine and Kazakh people in 30s, 2930s. It was genocide against this two nationality, because if you look in the history of Russian people, they were not Russians, they were Turks, they were Mongols, even their DNA. But unfortunately, they don't want to acknowledge it as if it's like a shame. And if they want to give all these territories, they need to give to Kazakhstan all this territory. To get rid of these people, they create semi-palatins, they anatomic, like during 2030s, 3 million of Ukrainian people were killed during the combat. 3 to 5 million of Kazakh people were killed. So genocide was against this nationality. And Ukrainian people have DNA, Turkish DNA, and European people, every first man has blood in their DNA. It's more complicated, but what the Russian claims is based on lies and intentions.
So that was another long comment, and there's a lot of good information and people want to share viewpoints, but maybe I can ask everybody to keep questions a little bit briefer I think the gist of it was that in Jana's perspective, the famine in both Ukraine and Kazakhstan amounts to a genocide. Would you like to respond to those statements? Or
I didn't hear enough of it to be able to do so. Is it just asking if Kazakhstan is also a genocide?
yes.
Yes, I suppose if we say that Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, is a genocide, then I think the Kazakhstan famine likewise could be considered a genocide. And the technical definition of genocide after the Genocide Convention following World War II is that it's the intent to wipe out any of four categories. And I think the category in Kazakhstan would be nomadic peoples, because they tried to settle them and transform them into being collectivist peasants, which is not all that different than what they did in Ukraine. And it led to the deaths of millions.
Thank you. I think at this point, I would like to give you an opportunity to also add your point of view to the discussion. Professor Dreifort.
Well, I think it's been a great presentation. The maps are very, very useful, and I think it gives a good perspective on how the Ukraine has moved boundary-wise over the centuries. I think the whole argument that Prof makes that Ukraine is not really a country is belied by those maps. And I think also goes back to some of the early history. I'm sometimes reminded of Vladimir the Great. We're talking about current Vladimir. Many of you may or may not know, that the Vladimir of the 10th century actually brought Ukraine into the Christian faith. But his background itself was in many ways Viking oriented. In fact, there's some argument that the origins of Kiev were with the Vikings coming to that area during the course of the 9th century. There's some argument that the word Russia made up the Viking word rower. Well, it's true or not, I don't know, but point of it is there has been substantial influence in that area by non-Russian speaking peoples, whether it's the Vikings or, as you pointed out, the Poles. You could go back and say, well, this area belongs to Poland, or belongs to the Lithuanians, or belongs to the Austrians. I mean, they've all had their share of influence in that area. And so the claim that Putin makes that, well, this is Russian and that this is not really a country itself that belongs to Russia is, I think, bogus from the beginning. A point that I would make about just picking up on some pieces here on the Ukrainian genocide in the 20s or 30s. I think it's sort of a combination of both ineptitude on the part of the Stalinist regime, but also determination to eliminate a fairly prosperous Ukrainian peasant agricultural sector, which they were. The kulaks were a very prosperous element in the Ukraine, which would not look good if they were successful in the view of the communist system and the collective farms that they want to create. So I think in a way it was probably a combination of Stalin's bloodiness, but also a determination to wipe out that group that challenged the communist influence and communist system that they want to impose on the Ukraine. So I think just a point there. A couple of other things, and I would make probably a long-winded lecture on this for my classes, but I think there's always been a debate about how Western Russia really is anyway. It's always been dogged by several factors, I think, some of which our speaker alluded to. One, of course, is geography, being a landlocked province or area for a long time. Muscovy needed to expand and eventually did, to acquire access to ports for commercial purpose, but also for political military purposes as well. But that was a slow slog over many centuries that finally they were able to achieve control over Siberia and Central Asia, and even slower to acquire influence in Central and Eastern Europe. As I recall, the acquisition of the North Shore of the Black Sea really didn't come until Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century. It was a long time before Moscow's influence was able to secure what Peter the Great wanted, which was what he called windows to the west, that is access to either the Baltic and preferably the Black Sea. And that was a long slog. And I think that the geographical isolation that the Russians endured for centuries has a lot to do with their thinking. I think the fact also was that the Mongol invasion in the 13th century had a lot of influence as well. For 2.5 centuries, the Mongols influenced, culturally at least, as well to some degree politically, the development of Russia. And I think when they were finally pushed back after 2.5 centuries, there was left a residue of East Asian cultural influence. Not so much mixing of blood, but certainly mixing of cultures. And so I think the willingness or the tendency to adopt absolutist measures in governance, cultural measures such as female seclusion, very conservative nature of the Russian peasantry, I think in a lot of ways goes back to that overlay of cultural influence that the Mongols left behind as they were pushed back. And I think also there was the effect of Christianity. In the West, church leaders went to Rome. In the East, the church leaders went to Constantinople, where they're influenced by the Byzantine and Greek Orthodox faith. There's a difference there in the view of the world. So in a lot of ways, Russia, I've cautioned my students, is not very easy to really understand if you're only looking at it through a Western lens. Somebody once asked, where's the best place to be in the case of war that Putin might start? Is it better to be in Moscow, or better to be in London or Paris? And somebody else said, no, it's better in Putin's head. Well, good luck with that. What is in that head? It's very hard to know. And I think if you try to apply Western standards, Western thinking, Western ideas to Putin, I think that's a very, very tenuous thing to do. The effect of this, I think, is that overall, Russia was not in the mainstream of Western thinking. And Westernization is not a geographical place. It's not maps. I mean, it's important. Maps are important, don't get me wrong. But, Russia, in a sense, is European, but not Western. Japan is Asian, but Western. It's an idea. There's an Enlightenment idea there about how institutions should be run, how the thinking of Western institutions should be developed. And I don't think the Russians have ever really adapted to that, partly because of their historical and geographical background. So, it's much more complicated than that. But I think in a nutshell, I think when we try to apply Western thinking to Russian actions, I think it becomes a very tenuous thing. I'd be curious on what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm just thinking through some other things as well. I mean, West is an idea, and one of my favorite slogans in Istanbul is that it's where East meets West. Although I have to admit, I've seen the same sign in Mississippi. So I'm never quite sure where West is or East is, but you're right, it is an idea. It is definitely an idea, and you can make that statement. I'm going to share screen again just for one moment, if I may, to show you this article and then describe this article briefly, because it's a wonderful scholarly historical article that explains how the Soviet Union made all of these ethnic republics. That's why you have Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, etc. And in effect, what the article shows is that Russia was this monster of a republic that got the leftovers. In effect, it's in terms of its land, it's huge, but it has no coherence as a republic, because after they had assigned Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and they went to all the republics and figured out what their boundaries were, Russia was just whatever was left over. And I think that's kind of an interesting example too, as to how this has evolved, because this thing where Russia's trying to recover ethno-linguistic provinces that are Russian is part of that story. And this article by a fellow named, well, I got to look, what was the guy's name? Slezkin, this fellow Slezkin. So this is a hugely famous article within Russian and Soviet studies, Slezkin. That's how I found it. Somebody said, oh, read this because it'll blow your mind. What he does was he uses a metaphor of those old communal apartments that were pre-Khrushchev. So back in the day, you'd have like 4 families sharing a communal space in Soviet housing, and they would share the bathrooms and they would share the kitchens, and they would just have their own bedrooms. So it's almost like a dormitory apartment setup. And what he said was that the Russian Republic is that space in the middle. Everybody has their own bedroom. Russia's what's left in the middle, and it's the communal space. It's a brilliant metaphor, if nothing else. I'm sorry if that's a bit of a digression. That's what occurred to me while I was trying to listen.
I think it's all interesting background from my perspective anyway. I think maybe we can take a few more questions. If there are any.
Let me throw something in here that I think is historical to some extent, but also contemporary. And that is, there was an article by Michael Cochran at Princeton, who argues that the Russians for centuries have created a system of despotism that creates the seeds of its own destruction, to borrow a Marxian term. And that is that the despot, as it were, and the article I've got right here, it's kind of interesting, but the despot creates a situation whereby he surrounds himself by sycophants who only tell him what they think he wants to hear. And the number of sycophants get larger and larger, but the information gets less and less. And ultimately, what you have happen is that the system implodes because of the inability to keep contact with what's really going on in the country. And I think the Russians have done this repeatedly, whether it was under the Romanovs or under Stalin or now under Putin. The end result will be the same. And by extension, I'm sorry, I got to politicize it a little bit. It's true of many organizations where the leader expects loyalty, and those people are too willing to commit loyalty to him by telling him the lies they think he wants to hear. And it becomes an echo chamber. And that's exactly what Putin is in right now. That's what Stalin was in, and those after him. And it was sort of true that close second and the czars before him. So to some extent, it's not strictly speaking a Russian phenomenon, but it certainly has been quite typical of a lot of Russian rulers over the past.
All right, thank you. Maybe I'll take one question that's on my mind. So we've talked about this NATO expansion and from the Russian perspective, encroachment right up onto the Russian borders. After 1989, would there have been an opportunity for NATO to respond differently and to establish a different world security framework that doesn't pitch East against West? Would there, at least in some alternate dream universe, have been a perspective to avoid the present conflict? Or is it really Putin with his fantasy of re-establishing the Soviet Union, and the security framework, of course, might be an issue, but really wouldn't have prevented the situation we find ourselves in? Maybe reality is not quite as either or, but what are either of your perspectives on that?
Well, I personally think that the US really has been pushing Russia around for the last 30 years. And every now and then somebody in the 90s or early 2000s would stand up and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be ignoring Russia's interests so blatantly. And everybody would then say, well, they don't matter. And I remember a Turkish friend of mine, this is an interesting side anecdote, a Turkish friend of mine in 2016 was very happy that Trump won, but not in a way that you might predict. She was convinced that if Hillary Clinton had won, that there would be a war between Russia and the US. And now, you know, what is it now, 6 years later, she would argue, although I haven't talked to her about this, I think she would argue that this is the same sort of liberal American interventionist tradition, just now it's through Biden instead of through Clinton. So that is at least one Turkish perspective. And they would say that the US has been overstepping ever since 1989. And I don't necessarily totally agree with that perspective, but I certainly do think that in the 90s, when Yeltsin was in power, terrible things happened in Russia. And a lot of those terrible things that happened were because we were going in there and just destroying their industry through investment. I mean, that may sound like a Marxist perspective. Maybe it is a Marxist perspective, but our investors and our own oligarchs in the 1990s did serious damage to that country. And in a sense, they're coming back now and they're angry.
I would ask one question, however. What if Poland and the Baltic states and Romania and so forth were not in NATO right now? What would the situation be in Eastern Europe? What would their attitude be? What would they feel? Why is it that the Finns have even talked about joining NATO, or even the Swedes have muttered about it? The fact of the matter is, having experienced Russian dominance or Soviet dominance over the course of the 20th century, they were not eager to be left out there wide and dry. And I think that's why these other countries are interested right now. So it wasn't, I don't know enough about how the process went, but as I understand it, these countries applied to be in NATO. They may have been encouraged to apply, I don't know. But I think considering their background and their geographic situation, they would have been fools not to at least consider joining a security alliance that would protect them. One other thing I'd like to point out before we do have to wrap up, and that is, and it's probably not, you know, politically correct to say it right now, but let's not turn the Ukrainians into saints yet. Okay. The fact of the matter is, the Ukrainian mafia was one of the worst in Europe for a long time, and it's probably still there. It's just been, you know, subterranean for a while. The fact of the matter is, they were not admitted into NATO. They have not been admitted into the EU because they've had corruption problems, political instability problems for a long time. So, you know, Zelensky has, in many ways, been able to overcome or bury that under the social media role that he's played. But I not want to make the Ukrainian saints yet. I don't know how you feel about Ukrainian saints, but I wouldn't want to make that.
I know a lot of them. Wow.
All right, thank you for both of those perspectives. Any other questions, either here or on Zoom? I see one hand raised, let's take somebody on Zoom. Please unmute yourself.
May I ask a question if you don't mind?
Yes.
Yeah. So if we go back to the time of the First World War, then at that time the Tsar Russia forces had an aim at Constantinople, to capture Constantinople. Will any conflict with Turkey or their intentions to capture Istanbul, Constantinople come into their mind again, just to gain access to Mediterranean Sea again?
Do you mean Tsargrad?
I mean, I'm talking about the current Russian regime. If they are behaving like a Tsar, not like a Soviet Union, so they want to recapture all their land back. And Constantinople was historically one of those, cities that they always wanted. So do you think there'll be a conflict with Turkey?
I was making too much of an insider joke. The Russian name during World War I for Constantinople was Tsargrad. And they really did have as a goal to take Constantinople back. And while it may seem a very unrealistic goal today, as long as Turkey's a member of NATO and et cetera, and Turkey's a very populous and powerful country in its own right, that remains an idea at the back of their minds, I would argue. And it certainly was as recently as World War I, a goal of Russian foreign policy to take NATO, or sorry, to take Constantinople. So that could always reemerge, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Would you like to add? Yes.
Just a maybe flip response to the Turkish question. Two things. One, the relationship between the Turks and the Russians has always been, historically anyway, at odds. And I think periodically we saw Erdogan cozying up to Putin. I think long-term Russian interests in the Black Sea area run counter to Turkish interests. Frank Fukuyama, I think this past week, made a comment though related to Turkey. Said a bestseller is going to be Turkish drones going forward. So the role that Turks have played in the combat so far has been fairly significant, probably with the use of Turkish drones by the Ukrainians.
Yeah, on that note, it was Turkish drones that allowed Azerbaijan to defeat Armenia now a year and a half ago. Yeah. And those Turkish drones were a game changer in that conflict. And you know how there's been these 5 or 6 Russian generals that have died? I'm personally curious as to whether they were killed by these same Turkish drones, which if you're able to use effectively, can do things like that, take out a specific person that you're looking for. And that might be something that'll emerge later.
All right, we have another question online. Somebody by the name of Galaxy Tab.
I think that's how I came on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I didn't put my name on there. Anyway, this is Michelle Yapay. I took Russian history, oh gosh, 20 years ago, and I don't remember a whole lot of it. And I do know Russians have very long memory and so forth, but Russia and Germany have been fighting for over 800 years. And a lot of it was over religion because Russia, a Russian princess or noble went down to Constantinople and married there. And so they adopted the Eastern Orthodox Church, where the Germany and Europeans adopted the Roman Catholic. So there was a lot of little wars and battles going over about religion. So I can understand why Russia didn't want, avoid religion. And also because they, after World War II, now I don't agree with it, but I understand why they took those countries, because they were tired of being attacked by German or Germanic tribes, before they became actually Germany. And my question, well, I have a question and then I also have a comment afterwards, but one of my questions was, do you think since Putin was raised and did the, he was in KGB and so forth and has the old school of mind that he's trying to make a name for himself to take over those countries, and also felt threatened that if Ukraine went to NATO that they would be attacked. And so by taking back Ukraine, it would also be protecting their borders. Could that be true? Or
I think it could be. One thing I'll just point out is never forget that Catherine the Great was herself German, and that
right.
the German-Russian ties are far closer than we can sort of imagine from here. They know each other as well as, and there's conflicts there as well. They know each other as well as French and English know each other, with the same kind of checkered history, and ditto with Turks and Russians. That's also a very old history. So when you're in Turkey and you're in Central Asia, you meet a lot of people who are fluent in both Russian and Turkish, especially the Tatars, for example. And the other, so yeah, he could be trying to make a name for himself, but also remember that when he would meet Angela Merkel, she was fluent in Russian and he was fluent in German. And well, I don't know if she was fluent, but she could converse in Russian based on growing up in East Germany. And they got along reasonably well in each other's languages. So the ties are not just conflict. There's sometimes conflict and sometimes not conflict.
Right.
And the other thing I'd point out is there was an earlier question about like what would Poland and the Baltic states do, and it occurred to me that the Warsaw Pact countries really don't seem to want to go back to the Warsaw Pact. And that's across all generations, as far as I can tell. So you're not going to find like elderly Hungarians who wish they were still in the Warsaw Pact. But in the former Soviet Union, it's different. Anyone pretty much over the age of 40 has a memory of the Soviet Union. And in most cases, it's a positive memory because life hasn't gone that well since it fell apart. So, I mean, I saw this in Azerbaijan quite a bit. Every time I'd meet anyone who was old enough to remember the Soviet Union, they wished it was back. And one thing I noticed on, I don't know, NBC Nightly News or something the other day, is there was a tank with the Soviet Union flag on it. I'm like, wait a minute, is that a Russian tank or a Ukrainian tank? And I think it was a Ukrainian tank because it did not have the Z on it. And that's not a contradiction. You can be very pro-Soviet and very anti-Russian at the same time in this conflict.
Right. Well, the one other comment I have, and it's I volunteer out at Cowtown, and one time I was out there and I talked to this guy who actually worked for the Koch family, not any of the industries. And it's a little known thing that a lot of people don't know is that this is back in around 2014, 2015, where they're having a lot of problems with Ukraine and, the oil pipelines and so forth. And they were talking about the pipelines, and he told me that, Koch's father built the oil and the oil drilling under Stalin. Well, the Koch family still owns those pipelines that run from Russia into Ukraine. Now, I don't know if they're still in use, but because we'd be pretty old, but he was telling me that they still own those pipelines. So Russia is maybe not be totally cut off, but they're still, they have, companies still have stuff in there. I mean, they do today, of course, but I thought that was kind of interesting because it was one of the things I never hear of and a lot of people don't seem to know. That
I hadn't heard that.
Industry is still making money off of it, I think.
That might have happened in the 90s. I hadn't heard that.
Well, it was the pipelines he built in the 1920s when he was building all that stuff under Stalin. And that's where he got his first money.
Yeah, I think
that's where the fortune was made. And and they went on, you know, to build those pipelines, and the family still known. So.
Well, thank you for that comment. We have one more question in the audience here, so let me get.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
I just have a quick one. This says could the invasion have been prevented? What should be done now to end the war?
Oh, well, let's not let it get in. Let's,
Have been prevented is maybe something we've addressed a little bit with my question about NATO, but where do we go from here? Somebody online also asked, what about you know, a map that supposedly shows Russian plans to invade Moldova later on, and so on. So I think we saw one slide where you summarize the Russian point of view currently with the demands on splitting Ukraine, recognizing Crimea, and so on, essentially limiting the attention to just Ukraine. But would that then really satisfy the Russian initiatives that led to the invasion, or would there be follow-up action after whatever you might consider a success in Ukraine? Would that embolden further action? I guess that's maybe the question.
I think my way of thinking is, and you hear this expression a lot in diplomacy, you know, you need to provide an off-ramp. They keep saying that, but they're not really presenting much of an off-ramp. I mean, people are very angry right now, justifiably, but someone said they have to withdraw and then they got to pay for all the damage they did. And I don't see that as a recipe for ending the conflict. I see that as a recipe for another conflict, maybe in 20 years. So we should, as the West, not be vindictive at all. We should try to figure out a way to give Putin an exit, and an exit that he can accept. Otherwise, we're replaying the mistake of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and we're replaying the mistake that was also made vis-a-vis Iraq and Kuwait, where Iraq was paying for Kuwaiti damage, you know, well into 2010 and 2013, which destroyed Iraq for the sake of Kuwait. And if we do the same thing to Russia, then for the next 10 or 20 years, Russia will be impoverished to rebuild Ukraine. And then in 25 years, they'll be back again. And I don't think that's the way to go. So Biden's comment, which I don't think was an accident, I think that was a trial balloon the other day about regime change, that was exactly the wrong thing to say. And I think it was very aggressive, and I don't necessarily blame President Biden as an individual, but I do think he's surrounded by the same advisors that were surrounding Secretary of State Clinton, President Obama, President Clinton, you know, going back 30 years. And I don't agree with them. I don't really agree with the GOP either, but they're kind of a circus clown at the moment. But, you know, so it's a very aggressive stance right now. And to suggest that the way this ends is with Putin being out of power is no way to end this conflict. That's just a way to escalate the conflict. And if it escalates, oh Lord, this could be the most dangerous thing in the last 80 years.
Just a comment on the off-ramp. There have been several things been proposed, obviously, but I think until one side or the other really takes a beating, worse now than they already have, and it's bad enough, there's not going to be much incentive to compromise on things. But I think one of the problems is going to be the old devil in the details thing. It's possible perhaps that the eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk could be given over to Russia or made independent. Crimea probably as well. I think one of the things that the Ukrainians would really balk at would be if they lost all access to the Black Sea by losing, especially Odessa, but that area around Odessa as well. They would need access through the Black Sea for international trade. Their grain exports, for example, would heavily depend on that access. So I think that's a problem. Just what would the details be? It's been proposed that there be sort of a Finlandization of Ukraine, like Finland existed for decades from the Soviet Union. There'd have to be some assurances that their security would be protected. Those things could be worked out, but I think until this war had probably gone on a bit further, I don't see there's much incentive to really commit to any kind of compromises or off-ramps, as it were. It'll take a while longer, I'm afraid.
So we are at an hour and a half and we don't pay our panel, but I also didn't promise them they'd get out of here at any particular time. So maybe we can take at least one more question from the audience. Oh, well, maybe two. I think Leslie, please.
Very quickly, I've been reading Reuters again. Apparently, the Turks, who are of course NATO members, are saying that Russian mines that were planted in the Black Sea around the Ukrainian ports have broken off and are drifting toward the Bosphorus. And wouldn't that be a horrific disaster?
That would not be good for the Bosphorus.
It would not be good for shipping, period.
Right.
I take it you could hear this question at least.
Well, there was a question.
Yeah, comment. Do you have a
I
comment?
don't have a comment, but it would surprise me a bit. And that's one of the reasons why the grain and shipping issues become so important. Nobody can get through those mined waters. So yeah, I know it wouldn't surprise me, but I read Reuters pretty regularly. I had not seen it, but that's interesting to know.
Just in the last hour or so.
I just had a quick comment, because what you were saying, what Mike had said, I looked at my hunting right here, Ken, and I had said the same thing. So I appreciate your comment. I just didn't figure, I don't think he was making a good off ramp. And I think, if you back somebody in the corner, they're going to lash out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I agree.
I think something that's been left unsaid, though, through this whole conversation is Putin has his own domestic issues as well. He's playing to a domestic audience as well as an international audience. And I think we forget that it's at our own peril, despite the fact that he is a despot. He doing what he can to manipulate, opposition. And that's the one area that I think is unforgivable. Really, I mean, you can say, well, he's got Russian security interests in mind, and maybe he's been pushed into this by the West. I'm skeptical, but nevertheless, I'll buy that. But the way he has clamped down on domestic criticism, domestic public opinion, that's unforgivable. And his willingness to track opponents around the world, whether it's in Russia or Great Britain or anywhere else for that matter, I think is something that is unacceptable and should be prevented at all costs. And so I think what Biden said, of course, obviously they're trying to backpedal on this. If he had added one phrase that would have said, and that's for the Russian people to decide, it would have been a totally different thing. Now, whether he meant that or not, I don't know. There are others who were saying, yeah, that's what he really meant. But when you're ad-libbing, you can get in trouble.
So we talked about off-ramps. I have one more question in regards to Russian gas and Ukrainian grain. So how realistic is it to cut ties completely for Europe to stop importing Russian gas, for the world not to pay in rubles for Russian gas, and so that there are those ties that force maybe some level of cooperation. Similarly, the Ukrainian grain harvest is important around the globe, and we already see hunger in regions far away from Ukraine that experience hunger because grain shipments are delayed. And so what's the role of global trade and the source of resources on any future scenario?
We've all noticed the gas prices have gone up 75 cents a gallon in the last month. But what we may not have noticed is that in the rest of the world, wheat and grain prices are shooting up, or will be shooting up if they haven't already. And if Ukraine is unable to plant its grain crop, which seems likely, then that's going to have knock-on effects all over the world's food prices in the next year. And that's kind of scary because Russia and Ukraine are the main suppliers of grains throughout the Middle East and South Asia and other locations, nearer to them than here. And that will also affect our own food prices. So I don't see anything optimistic about the global economy coming out of this.
Well, I would add one more thing though, and that is probably the unintended consequence of all this is if we paid any attention at all, it's the need to get off of fossil fuels that are supplied by Russia or anybody else for that matter. And I think in a way, it's going to promote the alternative energy, lest we not be held hostage to these kinds of events down the road. So if we're looking for a silver lining, maybe that's one of them. I think one of the things that kind of is unknowable too. I see the Biden administration committed huge amounts of LNG gas for the Germans, and although that's great publicity, the bottom line is you don't just do that overnight. You've got to build the facilities, you got to build the ports, you've got to get it there. This is not something that's going to happen overnight to resolve the German fuel crisis. And I think if nothing else, it's going to make the Germans much more aware of the fact that they may need other things, like they need to restore nuclear power. And hopefully we can find new sources or new ways to build nuclear plants much less expensively, much less dangerously, a lot less waste. Probably there's some things in the works on that. So again, if there's a silver lining in all this, maybe the fact that it's going to push us into more of a green revolution, as it were, in terms of alternative energy supplies.
Yeah, I'm personally hoping to see fewer Ford F-350s on the road within a year.
And fewer trucks on the roads, and that could happen if we had better public transportation. So I guess with regards to food prices, now is the time to plant potatoes in your backyard. So, all right. Well, any other questions?
I'm sorry, just a gripe of mine, but when I see people finally get out of their cars and off their dead butts and drive through lines around the country, I'll be convinced that we have an energy problem. In the meantime, I like to have the gas that's wasted one drive-through in Wichita every day. I could drive a year on it in my Prius. I say there's several Priuses out back. Mine's one of them. Really, we don't take it very seriously as we should. So yeah, we're gonna pay more, but some of it's because of our own laziness.
Right. All right. Any other questions? It doesn't look like it. So yes, I'd like to thank both panelists. we've had many of you join tonight for the first time for Global Learning Center event. So please check us out on Facebook or on our website, globallearningcenterbridgegard.org, and look up the events coming up next month and every month except during our summer breaks. So thank you all for joining tonight, and thank you very much for your time, Dr. AlTikriti and Dr. Dreifort. Thank you.
And I'll hope to see you all again in person at some point.
That would be wonderful.